So this will be the final installment. So this will be the final installment of the lecture series on feminist literary criticism. So I don't know if you have your book with you. It might be worth turning to page 7. Okay. I read this out loud in class, and so I just want to take time, and I probably won't pause very much to explain. I'm just going to look up and emphasize certain words here and there, and hopefully that will suggest to you that there is a kind of textual practice, a kind of implicit argument at work in Mrs. Dalloway, maybe that an approach like Showalter's might miss, right? And an approach like Moy's, or the approach that Moy calls for, doesn't really practice but calls for, might be able to disclose and bring to light. Okay. So page 7. This is Clarissa thinking about Peter Walsh. For they might be parted for hundreds of years, she and Peter. She never wrote a letter, and his were dry sticks. But suddenly it would come over her. If he were with me now, what would he say? Some days, some sights bringing him back to her calmly, without the bitterness, which perhaps was the reward of having cared for people. They came back in the middle of St. James's Park on a fine morning. Indeed, they did. But Peter, however beautiful the day might be, and the trees and the grass, and the little girl in pink, Peter never saw a thing of all that. He would put on his spectacles if she told him to. He would look. It was the state of the world that interested him. Wagner, Pope's poetry, people's characters eternally, and the defects of her own soul. There's the bitterness. How he scolded her, how they argued. She would marry a prime minister and stand at the top of a staircase. The perfect hostess, he called her. She had cried over it in her bedroom. She had the makings of the perfect hostess, he said. So she would still find herself arguing in St. James's Park, still making out that she had been right, and she had, too, not to marry him. For in marriage, a little license, a little independence there must be between people living together day in, day out in the same house, which Richard gave her, and she him. Where was he this morning, for instance? Some committee, she never asked what. But with Peter, everything had to be shared, everything gone into. And it was intolerable. And when it came to that scene in the little garden by the fountain, she had to break with him, or they would have been destroyed, both of them ruined. She was convinced, though she had borne about with her for years, like an arrow sticking in her heart, the grief, the anguish. And then the horror of the moment when someone told her at a concert that he had married a woman, met on the boat going to India. Never could she forget all that. Cold, heartless, a prude, he called her. Never could she understand how he cared. But those Indian women did, presumably, silly, pretty, flimsy nincompoops. And she wasted her pity. For she was quite happy, he assured her. Perfectly happy, though he had never done a thing that they talked of. His whole life had been a failure. It made her angry still. She had reached the park gates. She stood for a moment, looking at the omnibuses in Piccadilly. She would not say of anyone in the world now that they were this or that. That they were this or were that. She felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. She sliced like a knife through everything. At the same time was outside, looking on. She had a perpetual sense, as she watched the taxicabs, of being out, far out to sea and alone. She always had the feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day. Not that she thought herself clever, or much out of the ordinary. How she had got through life on the few twigs of knowledge Fräulein Daniels gave them, she could not think. She knew nothing. No language, no history. She scarcely read a book now except memoirs in bed, and yet to her it was absolutely absorbing. All this, the cabs passing, and she would not say of Peter. She would not say of herself, I am this, I am that. Her only gift was knowing people, almost by instinct, she thought, walking on. If you put her in a room with someone, up went her back like a cat's, or she purred. Devonshire House, Bath House, the house with the china cockatoo, she had seen them all lit up once, and remembered Sylvia, Fred, Sally Seton, such hosts of people and dancing all night, and the wagons plodding past to market and driving home across the park. She remembered once throwing a shilling into the Serpentine. This memory is repeated on page 180, by the way, a very important moment in the novel. But everyone remembered what she loved was this, here, now, in front of her, the fat lady in the cab. Did it matter then? She asked herself, walking towards Bond Street. Did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her. Did she resent it? Or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely, but that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things here, there, she survived, Peter survived, lived in each other, she being part, she was positive, of the trees at home, of the house there, ugly, rambling all to bits and pieces as it was, part of people she had never met, being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she had seen the trees lift the mist. But it spread ever so far, her life, herself. But what was she dreaming as she looked into Hatchard's shop window? What was she trying to recover? What image of white dawn in the country, as she read in the book, spread open? Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. Repeated on 29, 38 to 39, 136, and 182. This late age of the world's experience had bred in them all men and women, a well of tears and sorrows, courage and endurance, a perfectly upright, stoical bearing. Think, for example, of the woman she admired most, Lady Bexborough, opening the bazaar. There were Jorrocks Johnson Jollities, there were Soapy Sponge and Mrs. Asquith's memoirs, and big game shooting in Nigeria, all spread open. Ever so many books there were, but none that seemed exactly right to take to Evelyn Whitbread in her nursing home. Nothing that would serve to amuse her and make that indescribably dried-up little woman look, as Clarissa came in, just for a moment cordial, before they settled down for the usual interminable talk of women's ailments. How much she wanted it, that people should look pleased as she came in, Clarissa thought, and turned and walked back towards Bond Street, annoyed. Because it was silly to have other reasons for doing things. Much rather would she have been one of those people like Richard who did things for themselves. Whereas she thought, waiting to cross, half the time she did things not simply, not for themselves, but to make people think this or that. Perfect idiocy. Perfect idiocy, she knew. And now the policeman held up his hand, for no one was ever for a second taken in. Ah, if she could have had her life over again, she thought, stepping onto the pavement, could have looked even differently. She would have been, in the first place, dark like Lady Bexborough, with a skin of crumpled leather and beautiful eyes. She would have been like Lady Bexborough, slow and stately, rather large, interested in politics like a man, with a country house, very dignified, very sincere, instead of which she had a narrow pea-stick figure, a ridiculous little face, beaked like a bird's. That she held herself well was true, and had nice hands and feet and dressed well, considering that she spent little. But often now this body she wore. She stopped to look at a Dutch picture. This body, with all its capacities, seemed nothing. Nothing at all. She had the oddest sense of being herself invisible, unseen, unknown, there being no more marrying, no more having children now, but only this astonishing and rather solemn progress with the rest of them up Bond Street, this being Mrs. Dalloway. Not even Clarissa anymore. This being Mrs. Richard Dalloway. This body with all its capacities seemed nothing. She had the oddest sense of herself being herself, invisible, unseen, unknown, there being no more marrying, no more having of children now. Bond Street fascinated her. Bond Street, early in the morning in the season, its flags flying, its shops, no splash, no glitter, one roll of tweed in the shop where her father had bought his suits for 50 years, a few pearl salmon on an ice block. That is all, she said, looking at the fishmongers. That is all, she repeated, pausing for a moment at the window of a glove shop where, before the war, you could buy almost perfect gloves. And her old Uncle William used to say, a lady is known by her shoes and her gloves. He had turned on his bed one morning in the middle of the war. He had said, I have had enough. Gloves and shoes. She had a passion for gloves, but her own daughter, her Elizabeth, cared not a straw for either of them. Not a straw, thought she, going up Bond Street to a shop where they kept flowers for her when she gave a party. Elizabeth really cared for her dog most of all. The whole house this morning smelt of tar. Still, better poor Grizzle than Miss Killman, better distemper and tar and all the rest of it than sitting mute in a stuffy bedroom with a prayer book. Better anything, she was inclined to say. But it might only be a phase, as Richard said, such as all girls go through. It might be falling in love. But why with Miss Killman, who had been badly treated, of course? One must make allowances for that, and Richard said she was very able, and had a really historical mind. Anyhow, they were inseparable, and Elizabeth, her own daughter, went to communion, and how she dressed, how she treated people who came to lunch, she did not care a bit, it being her experience that the religious ecstasy made people callous. So did causes. Dulled their feelings. For Miss Killman would do anything for the Russians, starved herself for the Austrians, but in private inflicted positive torture. So insensitive was she, dressed in a green mackintosh coat. Becomes the figure for Clarissa of Miss Killman, this mackintosh coat. Year in, year out, she wore that coat. She perspired. She was never in the room 5 minutes without making you feel her superiority, your inferiority. How poor she was, how rich you were, how she lived in a slum without a cushion or a bed or a rug or whatever it might be. All her soul rusted with that grievance sticking in it. Her dismissal from school during the war. Poor, embittered, unfortunate creature. For it was not her one hated, but the idea of her, which undoubtedly had gathered into itself a great deal that was not Miss Killman, had become one of those spectres with which one battles in the night, one of those spectres who stand astride us and suck up half our lifeblood, dominators and tyrants. For no doubt, with another throw of the dice, had the black been uppermost and not the white, she would have loved Miss Killman. But not in this world. No. It rasped her, though, to have stirring about in her this brutal monster. To hear twigs cracking and feel hooves planted down in the depths of that leaf-encumbered forest to the soul. Never to be content quite or quite secure, for at any moment the brute would be stirring, this hatred which, especially since her illness, had power to make her feel scraped, hurt in her spine. Remember the comments about body a few pages ago. Gave her physical pain and made all pleasure and beauty and friendship and being well and being loved and making her home delightful rock, quiver, and bend, as if indeed there were a monster grubbing at the roots. As if this whole panoply of content were nothing but self-love. This hatred. Nonsense, nonsense, she cried to herself, pushing through the swing doors of Mulberry's, the florist's. Okay. So I would, of course, love to talk with you about it, but I think it's always best done in conversation. I hope that in those pages you see the way in which Woolf is developing a certain mode of describing Clarissa's condition as a woman. It's a condition that certainly is not nearly as downtrodden as some of the homeless that are on the fringes of this book. Some women of lower classes who haunt the fringes of this book, and certainly of Miss Killman at the end of this passage. But nevertheless, it's a messy picture Woolf is developing in these pages. One that is at times theoretically robust. In fact, moving at times. That passage about the body, for instance, about Clarissa feeling as if she has no future. There is nothing but this going up Bond Street. For what future can she have if she's already been married and already had children? And yet at the same time, she has slipped into a certain complicity with the very cultural system, right, that the novel itself seems to be critiquing in these pages. Interesting. Okay. If what I'm saying doesn't make sense to you, I'm happy to talk about it in office hours or in correspondence via email. But I hope it does make sense to you, especially given the conversation we had a few weeks ago in class. Okay. All right, I'm done reading to you this time. Hopefully I'll be moving on. I'll be doing plenty of reading in the next lecture series too. But I hopefully later today will be posting the first few installments of the Queer Studies lecture series, and hopefully get that done this weekend, and also start on the lecture series for the material we covered last week, okay? Historicism and race studies. So anyway, I hope you are having a good day. It's a little cloudy outside. I wish it was sunnier, but I do wish you a happy day. All right.